I mean, Facebook is already kind of changing into the metaverse or something like that. I've been hearing. Have you guys heard about that? They've
Oh
already.
yeah, that's definitely what we're talking about. Facebook's called Meta now, and
Yeah.
they're really going to focus on the metaverse. Mark Zuckerberg changed his profile picture to a really famous Bored Ape Yacht Club NFT. Uh, Generally, what do people think about
I
that?
think that was fake.
Okay, that was
But
fake. Never mind. But
I mean, I wouldn't put it past them at some point in the future because, and I'm sorry I'm interrupting. I do think this is a desperate attempt at relevance and sort of a backdoor into blockchains and possibly cryptocurrency for them, having failed to do it, the DeFi way. I'm excited about this because I think this will be the end of the company. So good stuff.
I don't know.
But go on.
They also have their Oculus VR headsets, which, like, to be honest, are really popular. Like, I've even tried other VR headsets and I find them to be better, but Oculus just got really popular all of a sudden because of how easy it is to use. And it was just kind of sad. Like, people who are normally, against Facebook's values on privacy and whatever, and then you just see they have like an Oculus headset. Like, what are you doing?
if I remember correctly, they actually removed the Facebook login requirement from Oculus headsets. So in some sense,
I think it's being removed. I believe it's still in place, and I don't have one. Like, there's zero interaction for me in Facebook in my life. Like, no apps, nothing, right? So, but I do think that, from what I read, rather, is the login is still there, and for what it's worth, the HTC headset's supposed to be very good. So
yeah, it's amazing. But it's just a lot of setup. Like, it's not as convenient. Maybe improved now though. I'm talking like years ago.
Well, they just made a new one which looks much sleeker. It's much smaller. But the other thing is, I feel like the target market is probably hardcore gamers, and they're probably used to the complexity anyway because they build these gaming rigs themselves most likely anyway. So it's probably well received by the target market. But the new one, if you haven't seen it, it is definitely sleek.
Yeah, I guess not everyone wants to look like a cyborg. To each their own.
Any other takes on Facebook/Meta? Well, there is a platform play to be had, right? So Facebook, if you look at how they went about their stablecoin, first they tried to build their own blockchain. First they did a grab, and they built a consortium, and they tried to devise a completely new platform. That didn't work. There was a lot of pushback, but the net result was, I think they ended up launching an ERC20 coin on the Ethereum blockchain. So all in all, that's actually pretty crypto friendly or compatible, whatever you want to call it. They went from embraced extinguish to just doing what everyone else is pretty much doing. Now with this Meta thing, I agree what Navi pointed out. They are building some really cool technologies, but the disintermediated nature of blockchains, I think it'll make it really hard for them to have a closed ecosystem. So they might have to whittle down their product offering yet again and end up with something reasonable, not because they want to, but because they're forced to. Thoughts?
Sorry, what did you say? The disintermediated nature of what?
Well, you can't build. It's really hard to build a closed app on a blockchain, right? Like unless you make an extraordinary effort and really go out of your way to close capabilities, which your competitors can then open up.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, in some sense, even though I don't use Facebook, I haven't used it for a long time. I don't necessarily trust any company at the scale of Facebook right now with my data, my behavior, my analytics. But I feel I still welcome their presence because it's inevitable that their ambition kind of gets whittled down into something that's actually crypto friendly.
Yeah.
I think they're definitely adapting, and definitely not because they want to. I seem to remember seeing a couple of headlines in the last week or so about how the changes that Apple implemented on iOS 15 with the cross-app tracking has really eaten into the business of companies like Facebook, like multiple billions of dollars. So that's exciting to see.
Well, sorry, to bring back to an earlier point, does metaverse imply blockchains? Like you can have a completely closed metaverse, right? Like I think we associate the two things, but you don't necessarily need to.
No, I mean, Second Life, right? That's been around for ages. And I don't even think that was the first example that was even moderately popular. I just can't think of anything else off the top of my head right now. But
Dungeons and Dragons.
well, sure, but I'm thinking about something like a persistent world with participation by the same group of people across
Dungeons and
sessions.
Dragons.
I remember back in the 90s, there was a really strict separation between meat space and cyberspace. And the two would be considered completely different worlds. And the ways in which we're talking about this metaverse is how people used to talk about cyberspace back in the day. So there's a really strong parallel between the two. Just because this is a new technology frontier, people kind of treat it not as a continuum but as a distinct world, right? So this cleave that people kind of perceive at the outset of this new sort of virtual space that happened in the 90s with the web and with cyberspace slash meat space is now kind of, I think, happening again. In this crypto frontier with
Yeah,
with the metaverse and the I don't know, the universe.
that's such a good point. And what's interesting is I think when this happened in the 90s, what was fascinating about it is that it had no place. Like there's no space to this, you know, cyber world. But now it's kind of the reintroduction of space into what we previously thought had no space. So yeah, there's a lot of like physicality to it that ends up being kind of circular.
I feel like it's intentional. And it is interesting for me to see the developments in the metaverse space, but it also really feels like the dystopian future I'm used to thinking about, because so what I mean by intentional here is that there is a way to create a version of your own identity separated from your physical one, and very intentionally create a different entity, one that, among other things, may be, let's say, richer than you are in the real world, and like better off in the virtual space than you are in physical space, and that's creepy to me.
Where do you think the intention is coming from? Like what's intentional about that?
I think people to some extent are selling escapism.
Yeah.
It's like I'm sure I'm making myself unemployable to a number of companies right now, starting with Meta.
Escapism is a necessary but not sufficient condition, I think, because there's so many motivations why people construct online persona. So it could be anywhere. So it's a sort of spectrum, like a multi-hued spectrum. One corner is people fleeing persecution or disapproval, right? So that's why you create an online persona. So it's the equivalent of someone having a blog on Tumblr and expressing their identity in a really oppressive environment. Another extreme is people just doing business. So I was reading about how the Cuban government has finally realized that a significant chunk of their economy is actually moving over to crypto. And a place like that, to do business, maybe you have to create a persona. I don't know, I'm not Cuban, but it kind of sounds like that. And then there's so many different motivations for creating these personas, and for the space to really take off, escapism, I think, is really important, but by itself it's not enough, right? Like it has to solve real world problems for real people.
I feel like to some extent the examples you mentioned aren't dissimilar from what I'm talking about, especially the first one with the anonymous blogging on Tumblr and like, how old are you anyway? In the context of being oppressed in the physical world. So it's related to me.
Yeah, so
I'm
that's
not saying that
where
escape
comes
is
in.
always strictly bad, but it's definitely, I think the separation between the physical and the virtual space is intentional. Unless we're talking about brands, like a lot of people are like, ooh, we're going to sell NFTs of virtual handbags. And it's like, okay. I mean, there's already a lot of consumerism, and I feel like this actually also feeds into escapism because, like, someone may not be able to buy some fancy whatever in the real world, but they can have an avatar in some metaverse that does.
I don't know, Mike. Have you looked at the prices? I think it's much cheaper to buy a Gucci handbag than a Gucci NFT.
I think we're still too early in the space for mass adoption.